My name is Captain Daniel Harris. I'm 36 years old, and I've been serving in the U.S. Army for more than a decade. Most people look at the uniform and see discipline, medals, and pride. But what they don't see are the nights that never end, the faces of men I couldn't save, and the silence that follows every explosion. Syria left scars on me that no one back home will ever notice, but I carry them every single day. When I was overseas, I held on to one thought: the idea of home. I imagined walking through my front door and hearing the sound of my son's voice again. Ethan is only 5 years old, but he has been the anchor that kept me alive during the worst nights of my deployment. He once sent me a drawing through my wife, Claire. It was just a stick figure picture, a crooked sun, and the words, "Come home, Daddy." That piece of paper lived in my pocket through firefights, long patrols, and nights where sleep never came. It was more valuable to me than any medal I'll ever receive. Claire used to write me that Ethan asked about me every single day, that he would sit by the window waiting for the day I'd finally return. And I believed her. I told myself that no matter how broken I felt inside, at least my family was strong, safe, and waiting for me. When the transport plane touched down back in the States, it was just after midnight. There were no banners or marching bands, just tired soldiers stepping off, carrying rucksacks heavy with more memories than gear. I grabbed my duffel bag and started the drive home. Every mile closer felt like a mile away from war. I thought the worst was behind me, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I turned onto my street. There he was, Ethan, my little boy, wandering the sidewalk in the middle of the night, wearing nothing but a set of wrinkled pajamas and dirty socks that were already tearing at the toes. His hair was a mess, his face streaked with tears. He wasn't playing, he wasn't exploring. He was lost, confused, and cold, and he was alone. I had spent months in Syria, carrying a rifle through streets littered with danger, and yet the most terrifying sight of my life was my son, abandoned in the quiet darkness of an American suburb. I stopped the car so fast my duffel slid across the seat. I ran to him, scooped him up in my arms, and felt how cold his little hands were. He clung to me with all his strength, whispering, "Daddy, you came back." I should have felt only joy in that moment, but rage boiled inside me instead. While I was out there fighting for my country, my wife had left our son to fend for himself in the dark. I didn't need an explanation, I didn't need excuses. I could smell the truth on his clothes, see it in his tired eyes. Claire wasn't home. She hadn't been home. And Ethan had been waiting until fear pushed him out the door. I carried him inside, wrapped him in a blanket, and turned up the thermostat that had been set far too low for comfort. The house felt abandoned, like it hadn't been cared for in weeks. Empty cans on the counter, glitter on the carpet, a half-eaten pizza box left open. It wasn't the home I had dreamed about in the desert. It was a place that looked like it belonged to strangers. I checked every room, the way a soldier checks a building for threats. Bedroom unmade, clothes thrown on the floor, makeup scattered across the vanity, curling iron still warm in the bathroom. Everything screamed carelessness, not the carelessness of exhaustion, but the kind that comes from someone who simply doesn't care anymore. I put Ethan to bed, turned on his nightlight shaped like a little moon, and sat by the door until he drifted off. He looked peaceful, like none of it had happened, like children somehow can. But I knew the truth. Tonight would leave a mark on him. Sitting there in the dark, I thought back to what the men used to call me in Syria, Crazy Harris. Not because I was reckless, but because when I finally lost patience, I didn't stop. I pushed harder than anyone, did what others couldn't. I didn't explode often, but when I did, no one wanted to be in my way. And now, standing in my own house, looking at the mess Claire had left behind and the fear she had left in our son, I felt that same fuse burning inside me. I had come home for peace. What I found was betrayal, neglect, and a 5-year-old who deserved better. I knew before the night was over that Claire was going to learn why the army calls me crazy. I stayed awake that night, sitting in the silence of my house, waiting for the sound of her car. My son was asleep in the other room, his small chest rising and falling under the glow of his nightlight, and all I could think about was how easily I could have lost him. I've spent years fighting wars in places most Americans couldn't point to on a map. But the greatest threat to my boy had come from within the walls of his own home. It was close to 3 in the morning when headlights swept across the blinds and a car pulled up outside. The bass of cheap music rattled the windows. I stood in the hallway, calm on the outside, but burning on the inside, as the door opened and Claire stumbled in. Her hair was done like she'd just walked out of a club, makeup smudged, perfume overpowering. She froze when she saw me. In that instant, I saw the realization in her eyes. She knew I had found Ethan outside, and she knew there was no excuse big enough to cover it. She tried to smile, tried to form words, but all I heard was the echo of my boy's weak voice whispering to me in the cold, "Daddy, you came back." I didn't ask questions. I didn't want explanations. I had lived long enough to know that excuses are the currency of people who refuse to face the truth. Instead, I walked past her, opened the closet, and pulled out her suitcase. Years of deployments had trained me to pack quickly, to separate what mattered from what didn't. I stacked her clothes, her shoes, her makeup bag, and the black dress she had left thrown over a chair. Every item I placed in that suitcase was a reminder of how far she had drifted from the woman I once trusted with my son's life. She followed me through the house, her voice rising, trembling, trying to justify, trying to plead, but I had already made up my mind. In the army there's a saying, you don't lower the standard to meet the situation, you raise the situation to meet the standard. That night, the standard was my boy's safety, and Claire had failed it. When the suitcase was full, I carried it to the front door and set it on the porch. I told her she wasn't sleeping here. Not tonight, maybe not ever again. Her face twisted between anger and fear, but she didn't fight me. Deep down, she knew she had crossed a line you don't come back from. I locked the door behind her, slid the deadbolt, and turned the alarm system on. For the first time that night, I felt control return to the house. Not peace. Peace was still far away, but order. I walked through the living room and looked at the glitter on the carpet, the empty cans on the table, the half-eaten pizza crust molding in the box. This was what she had traded our son's safety for. A few hours of noise, drinks, and strangers. I cleaned it up, one piece at a time, the way I had cleared rooms in Syria. Methodical, steady, no hesitation. The mess wasn't just trash, it was evidence of what had to change. I wiped the table, rinsed the glasses, and bagged the cans. With every movement, my resolve hardened. Before I went back to Ethan's room, I grabbed a Sharpie and wrote in bold black letters on a cardboard box, Claire, front porch. Tomorrow, I would fill it with the rest of what she would need. Not out of cruelty, but to make sure the boundary was clear. Lines are only real if you enforce them. When I finally stepped into my son's room, he was still asleep, his small hand clutching the blanket. He had kicked it halfway off, so I pulled it back over him and brushed his hair out of his eyes. For a moment I just stood there, staring at him, and I promised myself that he would never again have to wonder if someone was there to protect him. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Martinez, one of the few men I trusted with my life. "Heard your wheels down." "You good?" he wrote. I typed back, "Home. Kids safe. Long night." A minute later he replied, "Need me?" I looked at my boy sleeping and answered, "Not tonight, brother." The reflection I caught in the hallway mirror wasn't the same man who had left for Syria. My name tape still read Harris, but the eyes staring back were harder, sharper. I didn't look like a man who had just come home. I looked like a man who had just drawn a line in blood and was ready to defend it. I lay down on top of the covers in Ethan's room with my boots off and listened to the hum of his nightlight. Commanders used to tell us, standards are what you walk past. I had walked past enough in my life. Not anymore. The sun came grey through the blinds, and Ethan blinked awake to see me sitting there. The fear drained from his face the second he saw I hadn't left. He asked me if his mum was mad at him. I told him no, that none of this was his fault, that it was a problem between grown-ups. My job was to fix it. He nodded the way soldiers do when they accept an order. Then he asked if we could have pancakes. I smiled for the first time in months and promised him chocolate chips. While he dressed, I brewed coffee, cracked eggs, and turned the thermostat up. The house smelled like breakfast instead of perfume and vodka. It felt like a home again, even if it was only the two of us. As he ate, focused like a soldier finishing rations, syrup on his cheeks, I knew I had to take the next step. Heroes don't just fight battles overseas, they fight for their families too. So I took photos of the mess Claire had left behind, time-stamped and clear. Then I reached out to a family lawyer whose number I'd saved years ago under just in case. I typed, "Need consult, temporary separation and custody, mother left child unattended. Available today?" The reply came almost instantly. 10 a.m. works, bring documentation. I looked at Ethan across the table, his smile sticky with syrup, and for the first time, I felt hope. I pressed a glitter star I'd found while cleaning onto his napkin and told him it was for bravery. He saluted me with a messy hand and I almost laughed out loud. We packed a small backpack for him, snacks, a sweatshirt, and the stuffed dinosaur he couldn't nap without. Before leaving, I set the box for Claire on the porch with a note. "I'll call, not tonight." Driving down the street, Ethan looked out the window at the flag flying in the park. He asked me if we were okay. I told him we were better than okay. We were together. He reached across the console to hold my hand like he used to when he was 3, and I squeezed twice, a code between us. Safe. Here. Always. At the red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't see a broken soldier. I didn't see a crazy man. I saw a father who had made a decision and wasn't turning back. The light turned green. I drove forward, ready to face whatever came next. That morning, as I drove toward the lawyer's office with Ethan strapped in the back seat, I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't heading to a battlefield with a rifle on my shoulder, but it felt the same. My stomach was tight, my hands clenched the wheel like it was a weapon, and every instinct told me this was a fight I couldn't afford to lose. I had been trained to deal with enemies who carried rifles, launched mortars, and hid behind walls. But no one trains you for when the war comes into your home, when the person you trusted most becomes the reason your child was standing alone in the dark. That's a different kind of war, one that doesn't end when the shooting stops. The lawyer's office was a plain brick building with a faded flag out front. It looked more like a dentist's office than the place where families get torn apart and rebuilt on paper. I carried Ethan inside, holding his hand, and sat him in the corner with his dinosaur and a juice box. He didn't complain. He just looked at me like he trusted I knew what I was doing. That look weighed more than body armor. The lawyer was calm, professional, and spoke in the kind of measured voice I usually heard from commanders before a mission. He asked for the facts, so I gave them to him straight. I told him about coming home from Syria, about finding my son wandering the street, about the state of the house, and about the hours Claire had been gone. I showed him the photos of the cans, the mess, the time-stamped shots of the clock glowing 2:57 a.m. He nodded slowly, the way men do when they've seen enough. By the end of that meeting, I had a plan. We would file for temporary custody, establish boundaries, and put everything on record. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. My boy needed stability, and if Claire couldn't provide it, then I would. As we drove back home, Ethan asked if we could stop at the park. I said yes. I watched him climb the jungle gym with all the energy a 5-year-old has, and I sat on the bench, thinking about how many times I had dreamed of moments like this while I was overseas. In Syria, I used to pray for simple things. My son's laugh, the feel of his small hand holding mine, the sight of him safe. And now I had those things. I wasn't about to let anyone take them from me. That afternoon I cleaned the house the way soldiers clean weapons after a mission. Every corner scrubbed, every mess erased. I wanted Ethan to know this was a home again, not a party house, not a place where he was forgotten. When the rooms were finally spotless, I sat down with him on the couch. He leaned against me, holding his dinosaur, and asked the question I had been dreading. "Where's Mommy?" I didn't lie to him. I told him that Mommy had made some bad choices, that she had forgotten the most important rule. Kids always come first. I told him she loved him, but that right now she couldn't be here. He looked at me with wide eyes, searching for something. When I told him I wasn't going anywhere, he nodded and rested his head on my arm. That was all he needed. That night, after I tucked him in, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The silence was heavy, But it wasn't the same as the silence of war zones. It wasn't fear. It was responsibility. I thought about how many soldiers I'd served with who could clear buildings, jump out of planes, survive firefights, but who were crushed by the weight of family battles. Some of them drank themselves into oblivion. Some lost their kids forever. Some never came back from the war inside their own homes. I refused to be one of them. I thought about the nickname the army had given me, Crazy Harris. Out there it meant I was relentless, that when I was pushed too far I didn't stop until the mission was complete. Here at home, it meant I would not stop until my son was safe, secure, and never left alone again. If that made me crazy, then so be it. The next days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet evenings with Ethan. Claire tried to text, but I didn't answer. I didn't need more words. I needed action. The line had been drawn, and until she proved she could respect it, she had no place in our home. One evening, as I watched Ethan build towers out of blocks on the living room floor, I realized something else. I had spent years fighting for the American flag, for men I'd never met, for missions most people would never hear about. But the fight that mattered most, the one that defined who I was happening here, in this house, with this boy. And I wasn't going to lose it. The days after meeting with the lawyer felt like marching through hostile terrain. Calm on the surface, but I knew danger could appear at any moment. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened, expecting another message from Claire. She sent plenty. Apologies, excuses, sometimes anger, sometimes sweet words. I didn't reply. I'd learned in combat that you don't negotiate with instability. You set your perimeter, you hold your ground. Ethan adjusted faster than I expected. Kids are resilient in ways adults can't understand. He followed me through every task, watched me cook breakfast, sat at the table while I filled out documents, curled against me on the couch when the nights got quiet. He never asked if I was leaving again. He just wanted reassurance that he wasn't alone, and I gave it to him every chance I got. But Claire didn't disappear. 2 days after I'd put her suitcase on the porch, she showed up at the house. It was late afternoon, the sun dropping low, and I saw her car pull into the driveway. For a moment I felt that same tension I used to feel when I spotted movement on the horizon overseas. My pulse quickened, but my body stayed calm, steady. She stepped out dressed simply this time, no makeup, hair tied back like she wanted to look humble. She carried nothing with her, just her phone clutched in one hand. She knocked on the door lightly, like she was a stranger. I didn't let her in. I opened the door enough to stand in the frame and told her Ethan was fine, that he was safe, that he didn't need scenes or drama. She started to cry, said she just wanted to see him. I told her this wasn't the time. My lawyer had made it clear. No unannounced visits, no confusion for the child. She could see him when there was a structure in place, not when guilt or loneliness pushed her back here. She accused me of turning Ethan against her, of trying to erase her from his life. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't trade insults. I stood my ground the same way I had on distant rooftops, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the objective. I told her the truth. I wasn't keeping Ethan from her. I was protecting him from her choices. She broke down then, slumping against the car, sobbing into her hands. It hurt to watch. I won't pretend it didn't. This was the woman I had once trusted enough to leave my only child with while I went to war. The woman I had loved when we were younger, when life still felt simple. Seeing her like that twisted something inside me. But hurt doesn't erase betrayal, and tears don't undo neglect. I turned back into the house and closed the door. That night, I explained to Ethan in simple words that Mommy had come by but that she wasn't staying. He listened quietly, nodded once, and went back to playing with his toy cars. He didn't cry. He didn't beg me to let her in. That told me everything. Still, the weight pressed on me. In the army, missions end. You get extracted, the deployment finishes, or the orders change. But this didn't have an end date. This was a fight that could last months, maybe years. And I realized that if I wasn't careful, it could eat me alive the way combat nearly had. So I leaned into what I knew. I made schedules. Breakfast at 7, playtime outside after lunch, bedtime routine at 8. Structure is what keeps men alive in chaos, and it was what would keep my son steady now. We didn't need perfection. We needed consistency. Each night after he was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down what I had seen, what I had done, what progress we'd made. It felt like after-action reports, but instead of recording patrol routes and enemy fire, I was documenting pancakes, park trips, and nights without fear. It sounds small, but to me, it was proof that we were moving forward. And still, part of me wrestled with guilt. Was I being too harsh on Claire? Was I ending a marriage that might be saved? But then I would remember the sight of my boy in those dirty socks, wandering the sidewalk alone, waiting for someone who had abandoned him for music and drinks. That image answered every doubt. Some mistakes you don't get second chances for. People in the army used to joke that I had two speeds, calm or crazy. Calm when things held together, crazy when they fell apart. Here at home I realized there was a third speed, resolute. A state where I didn't need to shout, didn't need to break, didn't need to lose control. All I needed was to stand firm for the only person in this world who still saw me as a hero. And Ethan did see me that way. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he whispered that he wasn't scared anymore because Daddy was home. That single sentence meant more to me than every commendation I had ever been given in uniform. Medals can rust, plaques can gather dust, but knowing your child feels safe, that's immortality. I knew the battle wasn't over. Claire would come back again, maybe with lawyers of her own, maybe with anger sharper than words. But I also knew this. I wasn't the man she had left behind when I deployed. I wasn't the soldier who tolerated chaos for the sake of peace. I was the father who had seen his son alone in the dark and had sworn never to let it happen again. The army had trained me to fight wars abroad. Life had trained me to fight wars at home. And as I looked around my quiet house, as I listened to the steady breathing of my boy in the next room, I realized I was ready for both. The line had been drawn, and I was going to hold it no matter what. Weeks passed and the house began to feel alive again. Not because it was full of people, it wasn't, but because it was full of purpose. Ethan's laughter echoed in the living room, his footsteps pounded down the hallway, and for the first time in a long time, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. I woke up every morning before sunrise, not because I had to, but because years of deployment had trained me that way. I'd make coffee, lace my boots, and sit at the kitchen table with a notebook. I wrote down everything: Ethan's progress at school, the meals we shared, the conversations that told me he was healing. It wasn't paperwork, it was proof. Proof that I was holding the line. Proof that I wasn't failing him the way his mother had. Claire still called, still texted, but I answered only through the lawyer. I wasn't going to let chaos back into the house we were rebuilding. She said I was cruel, that I was cold, that I was destroying what was left of our family. Maybe she was right. But I'd rather be called cruel than stand over a casket one day, wondering if I could have done more. Ethan adjusted better than anyone could have expected. Kids don't need perfect parents, they need present ones. And I was there, every meal, every bedtime, every morning drop-off at school. He stopped asking where his mum was after a while. That silence hurt more than the questions, but it also told me he had accepted the new reality. Sometimes children understand faster than adults. People started to notice the change in me. Martinez came by one evening, dropped a six-pack on the porch and told me I looked different. Not broken, not angry, different. I told him I wasn't a soldier trying to survive anymore. I was a father, building something worth surviving for. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "That's the fight that matters, brother." And he was right. Still, there were nights when the rage tried to creep back in. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of Ethan out there alone in the dark. My chest would tighten, and my jaw would lock until I thought my teeth might crack. In Syria, that rage had been useful. It pushed me to go further, fight harder, never give in. Here at home, I couldn't let it control me. So I learned to turn it into something else, into discipline, into structure, into the promise I kept making to myself every day, never again. Some people say soldiers can't adjust when they come home. They say we bring the war with us, that we never really leave the battlefield. Maybe they're right. But I think what really happens is that the war changes shape. Over there, I fought men with guns. Over here, I fight neglect, betrayal, and the temptation to give up when life gets hard. Both can destroy you if you let them. And that brings me back to the name, Crazy Harris. For years it was said with a mix of respect and fear. It meant I was relentless, that when everyone else was ready to quit, I kept pushing. It meant I wasn't afraid to cross lines if it meant bringing my men home alive. Some thought it was reckless. Some thought it was dangerous. But they also knew it kept them breathing. Now back home, the name has a new meaning. Crazy doesn't mean out of control. It means willing to do whatever it takes when others can't. It means refusing to compromise when the stakes are too high. It means standing alone if that's what's required. The night I carried my boy in from the street, freezing in his socks, I realized something. If I had to fight the whole world to protect him, I would. If I had to stand against judges, lawyers, neighbors, or even family, I would. That's why they call me crazy. Not because I lose control, but because once I draw the line, nothing moves me from it. Ethan will grow up someday and ask for the whole story. I'll tell him the truth. I'll tell him his mother made choices that left him unsafe, and that I couldn't allow it to continue. I'll tell him that people called me crazy, but that I wore the name with pride, because it meant I never stopped fighting for him. And I'll tell him that every decision I made was out of love, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Claire will change. Maybe the courts will make things messy. Maybe there will be battles I can't even imagine yet. But I do know this. My son will never again stand alone on a dark street waiting for someone to care. Not while I'm breathing. Not while there's blood in my veins. Because I'm Captain Daniel Harris, soldier, father, protector, the man they call crazy. And if being crazy is what it takes to keep my boy safe, then I'll carry that name until the day I die.